The dust of redemption, Arizona, settled on everything. A fine red powder that clung to the soul. It coated the raw planks of the new chapel, filled the air with a coppery haze, and settled in the creases of Evelyn Carter's wedding dress. At 18, she felt the grit of it between her teeth, a taste as bitter as the day itself. The chapel bell, a loud and boastful thing shipped all the way from Ohio, had tolled exactly once, a hollow clang that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion. Inside, the heat was a physical presence, pressing down through the shingled roof, smelling of pine sap and the strained sweat of the handful of attendees. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards, tracing its whirls as if they held the answers to a prayer she was too frightened to voice. Beside her, the man who was now her husband stood silent and still. Tatsi. The name was foreign on the town's tongue, a sharp, guttural sound that people whispered with a mix of fear and contempt. To Evelyn, he was a silhouette, a presence defined by the space he occupied and the life debt her father owed him. Samuel Carter had gone hunting in the Superstition Mountains a year ago, chasing a rumor of gold, and had come back with nothing but a shattered leg and a story of a rattlesnake bite that should have killed him. It was this Apache man who had found him, who had drawn the venom and set the bone and carried him halfway back to redemption. A life for a life. The old laws dictated. But Tatsi had not asked for Samuel's life. He had asked for his daughter. Her father sat in the front pew, his gaze heavy, his face etched with a shame that had aged him a decade. Beside him, her mother Mary dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her shoulders trembling. She had fought it, of course. She had wept and pleaded, had called it a sacrilege, a betrayal of their own kind. But Samuel's honor, once broken, was a stubborn thing. A promise is a promise, he had said, his voice as brittle as dry leaves. He saved my life. We owe him what he asks. Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was perpetually dampened by the sweat on his brow, cleared his throat and brought the ceremony to its clumsy conclusion. His words about holy matrimony and the joining of two souls felt like stones thrown into a deep, empty well. When it was her turn, Evelyn had whispered her vow, the words catching in her throat like burrs. Tatsi's voice, when he spoke, was low and even, betraying no emotion she could decipher. He wore trousers and a plain cotton shirt for the occasion, clothes of her world that looked unnatural on his frame. They did nothing to hide the lean strength of his body or the stark, unreadable set of his features. His black hair was tied back at the nape of his neck with a simple leather cord. His eyes, when they had briefly met hers, were as dark and deep as a desert night. The walk out of the chapel was a silent ordeal. The townsfolk who had bothered to watch did so from a distance, their faces closed and judgmental. Mrs. Gable peered from behind her curtains, her lips pursed in disapproval. Thomas Briggs, a young ranch hand who had once brought Evelyn a handful of wildflowers, stood across the street, his arms crossed, his expression a thundercloud of resentment. He had called on her twice. Her mother had approved, but that was before the debt. Her father brought forward a pack mule, its panniers bulging with the meager dowry they could afford some blankets, a sack of flour, a cast-iron skillet, and her mother's Bible. Samuel's hands trembled as he passed the lead rope to Tatsi. He would not meet Evelyn's eyes. He is a man of his word, Samuel said, his voice raspy. He will see you are provided for. It was meant as a comfort, but it sounded like an apology. Her mother clutched her in a fierce, desperate hug, the scent of lavender and mothballs. The familiar comfort of her mother's embrace was almost Evelyn's undoing. "Be strong, my girl," Mary whispered into her hair, pressing the small, leather-bound Bible into her hand. "Keep your faith." The book felt like a cold stone against her palm. Faith in what? She wanted to ask. Faith in a God who would allow this. Then it was over. The last tie was cut. Tatsi swung himself onto his horse, a lean pinto that watched the world with intelligent eyes. He gestured for Evelyn to mount the gentle mare he had brought for her. She moved stiffly, her limbs feeling disconnected from her body. She did not look back as they rode out of Redemption. She could feel the town's collective gaze on her back, a brand of shame she was sure she would carry forever. They rode east, into the vast, indifferent landscape of the Arizona Territory. The sun beat down, and the heat rising from the baked earth shimmered in the air. The silence between them stretched, pulled taut by all the things that were unsaid and unknown. Evelyn had been raised on stories of the Apache. They were ghosts of the desert, fierce, brutal men who raided and killed without mercy. The man riding ahead of her was quiet, his posture relaxed in the saddle. He moved with the land, a part of it in a way she could never be. She watched the muscles in his back shift beneath his shirt, the easy way he guided his horse through the treacherous terrain of rock and cactus. He was not the monster from the stories, not yet, but he was the keeper of her future, and that was a more intimate and terrifying thing. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, bathing the mountains in hues of blood, orange, and deep violet, he finally drew his horse to a halt. He chose a spot in a small arroyo, sheltered by a granite outcrop. Without a word, he dismounted and began to make camp. His movements were efficient, wasting no energy. He gathered dry mesquite branches, struck a flint, and soon had a small, clean fire crackling to life. The flames pushed back the encroaching twilight, creating a small circle of light and warmth in the immense, darkening wilderness. He offered her water from his canteen. She shook her head, her throat too tight to swallow. He unpacked a strip of dried meat and held it out. She refused that too, wrapping her arms around her knees and staring into the fire. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows that made the rocks around them seem to move. The desert, which had been silent under the sun, came alive with the sounds of the night. A coyote yelped in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the hollowness inside her. The fire was a barrier between them. He sat on one side, she on the other. The church bell, the laws of her people, felt 1,000 miles away. Here, there were only the two of them and the vast, unforgiving land. The marriage was real. The night was upon them. This was her wedding night. A profound dread, cold and heavy, settled in the pit of her stomach. She knew what was expected. She was his wife now, by contract, by the debt her father had incurred. She was property, a part of a bargain. He had been patient, but the night was deep now, and the stars were scattered like chips of ice across the black sky. The desert air grew cold, raising goosebumps on her arms. She shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter, but the chill was deep inside her, a cold that no fire could touch. She thought of Thomas Briggs, of his clumsy advances and his confident smile. Marrying him would have been simple, familiar. She would have lived in a small house at the edge of town, raised children, and grown old within the predictable confines of her world. That life had been erased. Her future was now as unknown as the face of the man sitting across the fire. The fear she had held at bay all day finally overwhelmed her. It rose in her throat, a suffocating wave of despair and helplessness. She lowered her head, hiding her face in her hands as a tear escaped. Then another. She tried to smother the sounds, to cry silently, but a single, ragged sob broke from her lips, loud in the stillness of the night. Across the fire, Tatsi looked up. His face, illuminated by the dying embers, was impossible to read. He watched her for a long moment, and her entire body tensed. This is it, she thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. He rose to his feet. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself, praying for it to be quick. She heard his soft footfalls on the sandy ground as he moved, not toward her, but around the edge of the firelight. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, but he did not touch her. She risked a glance up through her tear-blurred vision. He stood a few feet away, holding a thick dark wool blanket. He unfolded it, the movement slow and deliberate. He took a step closer, and then gently, carefully, he draped the blanket over her trembling shoulders. His fingers did not graze her skin. The gesture was entirely impersonal, a simple act of providing warmth. The wool was heavy, smelling faintly of sage and smoke, and its weight was instantly comforting. He stepped back and returned to his side of the fire. He settled onto his own bedroll, arranging it so that his back was mostly to her, granting her a privacy she had not expected. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. The coyote called again, farther away this time. Evelyn sat perfectly still, the heavy blanket a shield around her. She was bewildered, her fear tangled with a profound confusion. Then his voice came across the space between them, quiet and low, not much more than a murmur on the night air. "You are safe here." The words settled over her, simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. It was not a demand, it was a vow. It was a gift. He was offering her sanctuary, not claiming a right. He was honoring a boundary that she had not even dared to hope for. "You are safe here." She watched his still form on the other side of the fire. He had given her his blanket. He had given her his word. He had given her the night, to be her own. The tears that came now were of a different kind. They were not for the life she had lost, but for this small, startling act of grace in the heart of her despair. A tiny, fragile seed of something she could not yet name had been planted in the barren ground of her fear. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the soil from which trust might one day grow. She pulled the blanket tighter, the coarse wool a strange comfort against her cheek, under its warmth. She finally lay down on her bed of sand, on her side of the fire, and let the immense, star-filled silence of the desert rock her to sleep. They traveled for another day, the landscape growing wilder, the familiar shape of the mountains around Redemption shrinking into a hazy memory. Evelyn's world narrowed to the rhythm of her horse's plodding gait and the straight, unwavering back of the man who rode before her. When they finally arrived, it was not with a grand announcement but a quiet merging into the land itself. The camp was nestled in a shallow canyon, hidden from the open plains. It was a collection of dome-shaped dwellings made of branches and hides, wickiups that seemed to grow from the earth. Smoke from a dozen small fires curled into the clear blue sky, and the air hummed with a life that was both alien and deeply ancient. The moment they entered the camp, a hush fell. Faces turned toward them, dark eyes filled with a guarded curiosity. Children stopped their games to stare. Women paused, their hands still in baskets of beans or over cooking fires. Evelyn felt her skin prickle under the weight of their scrutiny. She was a ghost among them, pale and out of place, a stark white figure in a world of earth tones. She instinctively pulled the wool blanket tighter, the one Tatsi had given her, as if it could make her invisible. Tatsi did not slow his pace or acknowledge the stares. He led their horses toward a wickiup slightly larger than the others, set near a cluster of ancient cottonwood trees that grew by a meandering creek. An old woman sat outside, her back straight and her hands methodically weaving a basket from willow shoots. Her hair, thick and white as spun silver, was woven into two long braids that fell over her shoulders. She looked up as they approached, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of 1,000 desert sunrises. She said nothing, but her gaze on Evelyn was intense, searching. A younger woman, perhaps a year or two older than Evelyn, emerged from the dwelling. She was slender and graceful, with a shy smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She glanced at Tatsi, then at Evelyn, a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Tatsi dismounted and spoke to them in their own tongue. His voice was different now, softer, with a cadence that matched the murmuring of the creek. Evelyn could not understand the words, but she understood the exchange. He was explaining her presence. The old woman listened, her expression unchanging. When he finished, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a welcome, not yet, but it was an acceptance. That first day, Evelyn felt like a doll, placed in a corner and told to stay. She sat on a hide just inside the entrance of the wickiup, watching the life of the camp unfold around her. She learned the women's names through gestures. The old woman was Neske, Tatsi's grandmother. The younger woman was Kimalis, his cousin. They offered her a bowl of stew made with corn and rabbit. She ate it mechanically, the food tasteless in her mouth, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. Tatsi gave her a space of her own within the wickiup, and then he was gone, disappearing into the society of the men, leaving her to navigate this new, female world alone. She felt a profound sense of abandonment, a fear that he had simply delivered her here and would have nothing more to do with her. The next morning, Kimalis approached her. She held up a bundle of dirty clothes and then pointed toward the creek. It was an invitation, an instruction. Evelyn rose and followed, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm. The women of the camp were already at the water's edge, their chatter a musical, flowing sound. They knelt on flat rocks, slapping wet garments against the stone, their movements practiced and efficient. Evelyn watched, feeling clumsy and useless. Kimalis handed her a shirt, one of Tatsi's. Evelyn knelt on a rock far from the others. She plunged the shirt into the cold, clear water and began to scrub it the way her mother had taught her, rubbing it against itself with a frantic energy. The fabric was rough under her soft palms. A woman nearby laughed, a bright, teasing sound. Evelyn's face burned with humiliation. Kimalis came over and knelt beside her. She took the shirt from Evelyn's hands. She did not speak. She simply demonstrated, her movements fluid and economical. She dipped the shirt, folded it, and slapped it against the rock with a firm, rhythmic motion that used the water and the stone to do the work. Slap, turn, dip, slap, turn, dip. She handed the shirt back to Evelyn. Evelyn tried again, mimicking the motion. It was awkward at first, her rhythm broken, but she focused, watching Kimalis's hands, feeling the weight of the wet cotton. Slap, turn, dip. Gradually, she found the rhythm. The work was hard, but it was honest. The sun warmed her back, and the cool water soothed her raw hands. For the first time since leaving Redemption, she was doing something, participating instead of just observing. It was a small connection, a single thread, but it was a start. In the afternoons, the women would grind corn. They used heavy stone medites, rocking a smaller mano back and forth to crush the dried kernels into fine meal. The sound was the heartbeat of the camp, a constant, rhythmic scraping of stone on stone. Neske gestured for Evelyn to try. The mano was heavier than it looked, and her first attempts were clumsy, sending more corn onto the ground than into the bowl. Her arms ached, and sweat trickled down her temples. Neske came and stood behind her, her old, surprisingly strong hands guiding Evelyn's, adjusting her posture, showing her how to use the strength of her back and legs, not just her arms. Rock forward, press down, rock back, release. Neske's touch was firm but gentle, the instruction of a patient teacher. Evelyn began to understand. It was another rhythm to learn, another piece of the life she had been thrust into. The days settled into a routine. Mornings at the creek, afternoons at the grinding stones. She learned to mend clothes with an awl and sinew, her stitches clumsy next to the neat work of the other women. She learned to identify the scent of burning juniper and mesquite. She learned the comfort of shared labor, the quiet companionship that needed no words. She was still an outsider, but she was no longer a complete stranger. The women would sometimes offer her a small smile, and she found, to her surprise, that she could smile back. In the evenings, Tatsi would return. He never imposed, never demanded her attention, but he would sit not far from her, mending a tool or sharpening a knife. He began to teach her words. He would hold up a piece of firewood. Ko, he would say, his voice low. Con. She would try, the sound flat and wrong in her mouth. He would shake his head slightly and repeat it, emphasizing the nasal tone. Ko, he pointed to the water skin. Tu, to the sky. Yeah, fire, water, sky. The words were simple, essential. Her tongue felt thick and clumsy, unable to form the right sounds, but she tried. Each night, she tried. One evening, after a dozen attempts, she managed a passable pronunciation of Shah for sun, a flicker of something, a ghost of a smile, touched Tatsi's lips before vanishing. It was more rewarding than any praise she had ever received. He was giving her tools, not just to survive, but to understand. He was building a bridge, one word at a time, across the chasm of silence that separated them. Her old life felt like a dream. She thought of her parents, of the small wooden house with its wilting geraniums. She thought of the whispers that must be slithering through the dusty streets of redemption. She's living with them now, gone native. The imagined words were a fresh source of shame. She felt a deep, aching loneliness, a sense of being caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Had she betrayed her family? Her people? The questions haunted her in the quiet moments before sleep, a constant, dull ache in her heart. She was learning to live here, but she did not yet feel that she belonged. The fear was still there, a quiet hum beneath the surface of her daily tasks. The fear that this acceptance was conditional, that one wrong move, one mistake, would shatter the fragile peace she was beginning to find. Weeks turned into a month. The sun browned her skin, and calluses formed on her hands. She grew stronger, her body adapting to the physical demands of her new life. She learned to anticipate the needs of the small family in the wickiup, to fetch water before the skin was empty, to add wood to the fire before it died down. These small acts of service were her new language, a way of showing gratitude, of earning her place. One afternoon, she was returning from the creek alone. The other women had already gone back to the camp. She was carrying a heavy, wet blanket, navigating the slick, mossy stones that lined the water's edge. Her mind was wandering, thinking of the Apache word for stone, tsa. When her worn leather shoe slipped, her balance was gone in an instant. The world tilted. She cried out, a small gasp of surprise as she pitched forward, bracing for the hard, bruising impact of the rocks and the shock of the cold water. But the fall never came. An arm, hard as iron, wrapped around her waist, catching her, pulling her back from the edge with a strength that took her breath away. She was pressed against a solid chest, her cheek against the warm cotton of a shirt. It was Tatsi. He had been nearby, watching, though she had not seen him. He held her steady, his grip firm and secure. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest. Her first instinct, the ingrained fear of the past weeks, was to pull away, to recoil from his touch. But she did not. She looked down at the strong, brown hand that held her arm, his fingers wrapped around her bicep. It was the first time he had truly touched her since he had placed the blanket over her shoulders on their wedding night. She felt the warmth of his skin, the latent power in his grip. It was not a violent hold, not possessive. It was protective. It was sure. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked up at him. His face was inches from hers, his dark eyes searching her own. She saw no anger at her clumsiness, no impatience. She saw only a quiet, steady concern. The fear she had lived with for so long, the constant, low-grade terror of the unknown man she had married, simply dissolved in that moment. It vanished like mist in the morning sun. He was not a monster. He was not a threat. He was the man who had caught her when she fell. A blush crept up her neck. She was acutely aware of their closeness, of the hard strength of his body against hers. He must have seen the change in her eyes, the fear giving way to something else, something new and unreadable. He held her for a heartbeat longer, as if to be certain she was steady on her feet, and then, slowly, He released her. He stepped back, restoring the respectful distance he always maintained between them. He bent down and picked up the fallen blanket, shaking the dirt from it before handing it back to her. He said nothing. He did not need to. She took the blanket, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She murmured a thank you, the English word feeling clumsy and inadequate. He gave a slight nod and then turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the murmuring creek, her heart still beating a little too fast. She watched him go, a profound shift taking place inside her. Trust was no longer an abstract concept, a hope for the future. It was a real and solid thing, as real as the rock beneath her feet and as strong as the hand that had kept her from falling. It was built not on grand gestures, but on the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, a blanket, a word, a helping hand. The incident at the creek changed the air between them. The careful, invisible wall that had stood between Evelyn and Tatsi now had a door. It was not a door they used often, but they were both aware of its existence. The rigid fear that had governed Evelyn's every move softened into a cautious curiosity. She found herself watching him more openly, not as her captor or the abstract figure of her husband, but as a man. She watched the way his hands were never idle, always mending a strap, fletching an arrow, or polishing the smooth wood of his bow. His economy of motion was a thing of quiet beauty, a silent conversation with the world around him. He continued to give her space, but the nature of that space had shifted. It was no longer a void of silence, but a comfortable quiet, a shared territory where words were not always necessary. He still taught her his language in the evenings, the lessons becoming a small, anchoring ritual. She learned the words for family members, for the tools they used, for the animals that roamed the canyons. Her progress was slow, her tongue tripping over sounds her throat was not made for, but her effort was a bridge. He never showed impatience, only a quiet persistence that encouraged her to try again. In the long, warm afternoons, when the camp settled into a gentle rhythm of work and rest, Tatsi would often sit in the shade of the cottonwood trees. While other men might talk or gamble, he would take out a small leather pouch. From it, he would produce a piece of bone, bleached white by the sun, and a shard of obsidian with a wickedly sharp edge. And then he would begin to carve. Evelyn watched him from a distance at first, pretending to be busy sorting dried beans or mending a seam. His focus was absolute. The world seemed to shrink to the space between his hands, the piece of bone and the cutting edge of the stone. His brow would furrow in concentration, his long fingers moving with a delicate precision that seemed at odds with the raw strength she knew they possessed. A fine white powder would dust his trousers as he worked, scraping, turning, and shaping the bone. She could not tell what he was making. It was a secret he held in his hands, and her curiosity grew with each passing day. She began to look forward to this quiet time, to the soft, rhythmic scrape of stone on bone. It became part of the afternoon's music, blending with the grinding of the medities and the murmur of women's voices. Kimalis noticed her watching one day. She came and sat beside Evelyn, a knowing look in her dark eyes. She said nothing, and Evelyn offered no explanation. There was a silent understanding between them. The making of a thing was a private, patient magic, not to be disturbed. The question of her old life still visited her, usually in the quiet moments before dawn. She would lie on her sleeping furs and feel a pang of guilt, a sharp sense of dislocation. What would her mother think? Seeing her daughter sitting in the dust, her hands stained with berry juice, her hair braided by an Apache woman. She felt the weight of the Bible that lay wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her pack, its presence a constant, silent accusation. She was living in a different world, learning a different language, becoming a different person. It felt like a betrayal, and yet, when the sun rose and the camp stirred to life, the feeling would fade, replaced by the simple, undeniable reality of her present. She was safe. She was learning. For the first time in her life, She felt as though her hands were connected to the real work of living. One evening, as the setting sun painted the western cliffs in fiery shades of crimson and gold, Tatsi finished his work. He held the object up to the fading light, turning it over and over, his critical eye searching for any imperfection. He blew away the last of the white dust and then tucked it carefully back into its leather pouch. Later, after they had eaten their meal of corn cakes and roasted quail, he came to her. The camp was settling down for the night. The fires were burning low, and the cool desert air was beginning to creep in. He sat across from her, the small cooking fire between them as it had been on that first night. But this time, the fire was not a barrier. It was just a fire. He reached into the pouch and drew out the carving. He held it out to her on his open palm. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took it. The bone was smooth and cool against her skin, polished to a soft gleam. It was the carving of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide, its head turned as if catching a current of wind. The detail was astonishing. She could see the faint lines of individual feathers, the sharp curve of the beak, the fierce, piercing eye. It was a hawk. She looked up at him, her own eyes wide with a question. "Itza," he said softly, the Apache word for hawk. He pointed to the carving, then gestured to the sky. "Strong, free." The words landed in her heart with a gentle weight. He was not giving her a trinket. He was giving her a meaning. He saw strength in her. He saw freedom. It was a vision of herself she had never dared to imagine. In redemption, she had been Samuel Carter's daughter, a girl to be married off, a piece in a puzzle of family and duty. Here, in the eyes of this quiet man, she was a hawk. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so new and overwhelming she did not have a name for it. He also held out a thin, dark leather thong. She understood. She took the cord and tried to thread it through the small hole he had drilled at the top of the pendant. Her fingers, usually nimble enough with a sewing needle, felt thick and clumsy. She was intensely aware of him watching her. The simple task felt monumental. After fumbling for a moment, she looked at him, a silent plea in her eyes. "Will you," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Will you help me?" It was the first time she had asked him for anything so personal. It was a request that crossed the carefully drawn line of their separate spaces. He gave a single, slow nod. He moved from his side of the fire to hers, kneeling in front of her. The space between them vanished. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of wood smoke that clung to his clothes. She held up the pendant and the cord. He took them from her, his fingers brushing against hers. A small shock, like a spark from the fire, jumped between them. It was a startling, intimate jolt that made her breath catch in her throat. She held perfectly still as he turned and moved behind her to fasten it around her neck. She tilted her head forward, exposing the nape of her neck, a gesture of profound and unconscious trust. She could feel his presence at her back, a warm, solid wall. She felt the whisper of his fingers as he worked the simple knot, his touch feather-light against her skin. When he was done, he moved back to kneel in front of her. The hawk pendant rested in the hollow of her throat, cool and solid against her warm skin. It felt as if it had always been there. "Itza," she said, testing the word, wanting to get it right, to honor the gift. The sound was not quite right. He shook his head gently. "Itza," he repeated, his mouth shaping the word with care. He was not just teaching her a sound, he was sharing a piece of his world. She tried again, concentrating, watching his lips. "Itza." Closer this time. She touched the pendant with her fingertips. "Itza," she said one more time. And this time, the sound came out clean and right, a perfect echo of his own. And then it happened. The quiet, watchful mask of his face broke open. A slow smile spread across his lips, reaching his eyes and making them shine in the firelight. It was not the fleeting ghost of a smile she had seen once before. This was a real, unguarded smile, full of a quiet pride and a gentle warmth that transformed his entire being. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The last of the ice that had encased her heart for months cracked and melted away in the warmth of that single, breathtaking smile. She smiled back, a real smile of her own, one that came from a place of genuine, unburdened joy. For a long moment, they simply knelt there, on either side of the dying fire, connected by the shared word and the shared smile. The rest of the world, the disapproving eyes of both her people and his, the weight of the debt, the uncertain future, all of it fell away. In that moment, there was only the two of them, the fire and the hawk. Later that night, as she lay on her sleeping furs, she could not sleep. The camp was quiet, the only sound the soft sigh of the wind in the cottonwoods. She reached up and touched the smooth bone at her throat. It was a tangible link to the man who slept just a few feet away, a man who did not see her as a debt to be collected, but as something strong and free, a gift. She realized was not about its value in gold or silver. It was about the intention held in the hands that made it. Tatsi had given her more than a carving. He had given her back a piece of herself. The smile he had given her lingered in Evelyn's mind for days, a small, warm ember she could return to in the quiet moments. It had changed the shape of their interactions, easing the last of the formal distance between them. A sense of gentle domesticity began to settle around their lives. They did not speak of love, or even affection, but it was there in the small gestures. It was in the way he would leave a particularly sweet piece of roasted cactus for her, or the way she would ensure his water skin was full before he left to hunt. The hawk pendant was a constant, warm presence at her throat, a secret reminder of the strength he saw in her. She was beginning to believe in it herself. The Apache camp had become the landscape of her life, the sounds of children laughing, the smell of cooking fires, the rhythmic scrape of the metates. These were now the markers of her day. She felt a growing bond with Neske and Chimalis, a comfortable companionship woven from shared tasks and unspoken understanding. The whispers from redemption, both real and imagined, had faded to a distant hum. Her old life felt like a story someone else had lived. She was down by the creek, the place that had marked so many turning points, rinsing the last of the soap from a blanket when she heard it. It was a sound that did not belong. A jarring note in the canyon's symphony, the heavy, iron-shod gait of a horse ridden hard, and a man's voice, slurred and angry, shouting her name in English. Evelyn Carter, I know you're in here." Evelyn froze, her hands submerged in the cold, clear water. The blanket slipped from her grasp and floated away on the current. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through the peace she had found. She knew that voice. She rose slowly, turning toward the edge of the camp. There, half hidden by the scrub oak and sycamore trees, was Thomas Briggs. He looked wild. His face was flushed with drink and sun. His clothes were covered in the dust of a long, resentful journey, and a heavy Winchester rifle was slung across his back, its weight pulling his shoulder down. He swung himself clumsily from his saddle, his boots stumbling on the rocky ground. The horse, lathered with sweat, blew heavily through its nostrils. "There you are," he spat, his eyes fixing on her. He took a few unsteady steps forward, the smell of whiskey reaching her even from 20 paces away. "I have come to take you home, to get you away from these savages." His eyes roamed over her, taking in her simple camp dress, her tanned skin, the way her hair was braided. His gaze lingered on the bone pendant at her throat, and his expression twisted into a sneer of disgust. "Look at you, living in the dirt, wearing their heathen trinkets. Have you lost your mind?" Evelyn's first instinct was to run, to hide herself in the familiar safety of Neske's wickiup. The shame he was trying to ignite in her flickered. A hot, ugly thing. He was her past, come to reclaim her, to remind her of what she was, of where she belonged. He took another step, his voice dropping to a wheedling, conspiratorial tone. Your mother sent me. She is sick with grief. Evelyn, your father sits and stares at the walls. This whole town thinks you have been taken. I told them I would find you. I told them I would bring you back. She knew he was lying. His words were poison, crafted to make her doubt, to make her feel the guilt he believed she should feel, but she also knew her mother's heart, and the thought of her sorrow was a sharp pain. I am not going with you, Thomas, she said. Her voice was quieter than she expected, but it was steady. His face darkened. The pretense of rescue fell away, revealing the raw, possessive anger beneath. Not going, you do not have a choice. You are a white woman. You belong with your own kind, not with him. Did my money mean so little? Did your father sell you so cheap to that redskin? The insult, aimed at Tatsi, struck her with the force of a physical blow. The fear she felt began to curdle, hardening into a cold, sharp anger. This man, with his sour breath and his cruel words, was trying to trample the fragile new world she had built. He was trying to smash the kindness she had been shown, to reduce it to a sordid transaction. She unconsciously raised a hand to the hawk pendant. Its smooth surface was an anchor. Strong, free. He did not buy me, she said, her voice gaining strength. He saved my father's life. He has shown me more respect and honor than you ever have. Thomas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that startled a bird from a nearby tree. Respect, and Apache knows nothing of respect. He knows how to take what he wants. I've come to take what is mine. You were meant to be my wife, not his property. He lunged forward then, his hand reaching for her arm. She stumbled backward, tripping on a loose stone. For a terrifying second, she thought he would catch her, that he would drag her away, back to the world of whispers and judgment. And then, he was simply there. One moment, there was only the tense space between her and Thomas. The next, Tatsi stood between them. He had made no sound. He seemed to have materialized from the air itself, a silent, deadly shadow. His face was calm, but his eyes were like black flint, hard and dangerous. He was not armed, but he did not need to be. His very presence was a weapon. The air crackled, the world narrowing to the three of them. The sounds of the camp, the creek, the wind, all of it faded away. Thomas stopped short, his hand falling to his side. He was bigger than Tatsi, heavier, but he seemed to shrink under that cold, unblinking gaze. The drunken bravado in his face was replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. You stay out of this, Thomas stammered, trying to regain his footing. This is between me and her, white folks' business. Tatsi did not speak. He simply took one slow, deliberate step forward. It was too much for Thomas's frayed nerves. With a curse, he reached back, his hand fumbling for the rifle on his shoulder. It was a fatal miscalculation. Before the rifle was even halfway into his hands, Tatsi moved. He did not rush. He flowed, in a single, impossibly swift motion. He closed the distance between them. He did not reach for the gun. He reached for the man. His hand shot out and seized the front of Thomas's shirt, twisting the fabric, his knuckles digging into the man's collarbone, with a strength that seemed effortless. He lifted Thomas up onto the balls of his feet, holding him there, suspended and helpless. Thomas's eyes went wide with shock and pain. A choked gurgle escaped his throat. The heavy Winchester slid from his grasp, falling with a dull, heavy thud into the red dust. The sound was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. It was the sound of a threat ending, of a power collapsing into nothing. Tatsi held him there for a long, stretched-out second, his dark eyes boring into Thomas's. He had not struck him, had not drawn blood, but the display of controlled, absolute power was more terrifying than any blow. The violence he was capable of was a palpable thing. held in perfect check, and that restraint made it all the more menacing. Finally, Tatsi spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. The English was clipped, each word a stone. "You will leave." He released his grip. Thomas stumbled backward, gasping for air, his face pale beneath the flush of drink. He stared at Tatsi, then at the rifle lying useless in the dust, and then at Evelyn. He saw no ally in her, no damsel to be rescued. He saw only a woman who had made her choice. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a raw, humiliating fear. "Go," Evelyn said, her voice echoing Tatsi's command. It was her voice that finally broke him. Without another word, Thomas turned, scrambling back to his horse. He hauled himself into the saddle, his movements clumsy and panicked. He yanked on the reins, turning the tired animal so sharply it whinnied in protest, and spurred it into a frantic gallop, fleeing back the way he had come. The dust he kicked up hung in the still air for a long moment before slowly beginning to settle. The canyon was quiet again. The immediate danger had passed, leaving a vibrating silence in its wake. Evelyn was shaking, a tremor running through her from head to toe as the adrenaline receded. She looked at Tatsi, who stood watching the space where Thomas had disappeared. His body was relaxed now, the deadly tension gone, but his face was grim. He turned his gaze from the trail to her, his eyes searching her face, checking for any hurt, any fear. He saw the tremor in her hands, but he also saw the resolve in her eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a shared acknowledgement of the battle they had just won, and of her part in it. He had seen her stand her ground. His gaze then fell to the rifle lying in the dust. It looked obscene, a piece of manufactured violence left to scar the natural earth. He did not move to pick it up. His first priority was her. The rifle could wait. The peace of the canyon had been shattered. Thomas Briggs was gone, but he would not be silent. He would ride back to redemption, his humiliation festering into a story of savage aggression. He would twist the truth, painting himself as the hero and Tatsi as the aggressor. The trespass had been more than just one drunken man. It was the long arm of her old world, reaching out to reclaim her, and it had left a poison behind. An invisible line had been crossed, and Evelyn knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not the end. It was the beginning of a much larger fight. The silence that followed Thomas Briggs's chaotic departure was heavier and more fragile than the peace that had preceded it. A nervous energy rippled through the camp. The women's chatter by the creek became muted, and the men moved with a new, watchful purpose, their eyes constantly scanning the high canyon walls. The abandoned rifle lay in the dust for a long time, an ugly metal weed. No one touched it. Finally, as twilight fell, Tatsi picked it up. He handled it with a clear distaste, as if it were a dead snake. He did not bring it to their wickiup. Instead, he walked far down the canyon and, with a powerful swing, threw the weapon into a deep, inaccessible crevice in the rock. It was a clear statement. This was not their way. But Evelyn knew that getting rid of the rifle did not get rid of the threat it represented. A week passed. 2. The rhythms of the camp slowly reasserted themselves, but the watchfulness never entirely left the men's eyes. A subtle but profound change had occurred in Evelyn. The confrontation had solidified her place, not just in her own mind, but in the eyes of the others. She had not cowered. She had not run. She had stood her ground and spoken her truth. When she walked to the creek now, the women's smiles were warmer, their nods more inclusive. She was no longer just the white woman Tatsi had brought among them. She was the woman who had faced down one of her own people to defend her new life. The first whispers of trouble came with a scout returning from the south. He spoke in low, urgent tones to the elder, a man named Deljain, whose wisdom was as deep as the lines on his face. The words were Apache, but the anxiety they created was a universal language. Evelyn, sitting with Neski and Kumalis, felt the change in the air immediately. The work in the camp did not stop, but a current of fear now ran beneath it. Later that day, Tatsi told her what had happened. His face was a stoic mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. A mail train on the new tracks laid 30 miles south had been robbed. A guard had been killed. The men who did it were said to be Apache. "It was not our people," Tatsi said, his voice flat and hard. "We have not hunted in that territory since the last treaty. This is the work of Coyoteros, maybe, or maybe it was not Apache at all." But Evelyn, who had grown up in redemption, knew how this story would be written. She knew that in the eyes of the soldiers and the settlers, there was no difference between one band of Apache and another. They were all just Indians. Guilt was a blanket thrown over all of them, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that Thomas Briggs's story would now have a ready and eager audience. His tale of a captive white woman held by violent savages would blend perfectly with this new story of a deadly train robbery. The two threads would be woven together into a single, damning narrative. The question of her own safety, once her paramount concern, now seemed a selfish and distant thing. A new, more terrible fear took its place, the fear that her presence, the simple fact of her being there, had drawn this disaster down upon them all. If Thomas had not come for her, he would not have a fresh story to tell. If she had never been traded for her father's life, this band would still be living in relative peace, hidden away in their canyon. The weight of that thought was a physical burden, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Should she leave? The thought was a sharp, painful betrayal. To leave now would be to abandon the only real kindness she had ever known. But to stay, did staying mean she was inviting their destruction? The answer to her unasked question came 3 days later. It did not come as a whisper, but as the sound of thunder on a cloudless day. It began as a low, persistent rumble, a vibration felt in the soles of the feet before it was a sound heard by the ear. The men in the camp stopped what they were doing, their heads lifting, their bodies going still. Then the sound grew, resolving itself into the rhythmic, percussive beat of dozens of horses moving at a steady, disciplined trot. A lookout high on the canyon rim gave a sharp cry. Panic, cold and electric, flashed through the camp. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them into the shadows of the wickiups. The old and the sick were helped into hiding. The women, their faces grim, began to gather essential supplies, their movements quick and practiced, born of a lifetime of uncertainty. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. They came into view at the mouth of the canyon, a long column of blue uniforms and gleaming metal. They moved with the inexorable, terrifying force of a river in flood. At their head rode a man on a big bay horse, his shoulders squared, his face set and arrogant under the brim of his campaign hat, a cavalry guidon. A small flag of red and white, snapped in the breeze, a stark slash of color against the muted browns of the desert. They did not ride into the camp. They halted on the flat open ground just beyond the first of the wickiups, forming a precise, menacing line. The jingle of harnesses and the snorting of the horses were the only sounds. The captain at their head dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a man in his 40s, with a thick mustache and pale, unforgiving eyes. He strode forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the saber at his side. Delgin, the elder, emerged from his wickiup to meet him. He walked with the slow, deliberate dignity of a man who had seen 100 seasons and feared very little. Tatsi was at his side, a step behind him, his face carved from stone. Other warriors fanned out behind them, unarmed but for the knives at their belts, their bodies radiating a coiled, defiant tension. Evelyn watched from the entrance of Neski's wickiup, her body half hidden in the shadows. She could hear every word spoken in English, and her blood ran cold. "I am Captain Hardin, United States Army," the officer announced, his voice loud and carrying. He did not introduce himself to Delgin. He announced himself to the canyon. "I am here on federal authority. A government train was attacked. A man was murdered. The tracks lead this way." No man of this band was near the iron road. Delgin replied. His English was slow, heavily accented, but clear and dignified. "We have kept the peace. We hunt in the mountains, to the north." Captain Hardin gave a short, dismissive laugh. "That is what you all say. Yet these attacks continue. A rancher's son came to the fort a few weeks ago. Thomas Briggs. He told us a story. Said you were holding a white woman here against her will. Said your warriors were threatening. It seems you have a taste for the white man's property." He let his cold eyes sweep over the camp, and for a moment they rested on Evelyn's half-hidden form. He did not acknowledge her directly, but a flicker of grim satisfaction crossed his face. He had found his proof. "The woman is my son's wife," Delgin said, his voice hard. "She is here by her own choice, and by the word of her father. The man you speak of came to our camp with whiskey on his breath and a rifle on his back. He made threats. He was told to leave. He was not harmed." "A convenient story," Hardin sneered. "Just as it is convenient that you know nothing of the train. I am not here to trade stories. Old man, I am here for justice." Tatsi took a half-step forward, a low sound like the growl of a mountain cat rumbling in his chest. Delgin put a hand on his arm, a gesture of restraint that was almost invisible. Tatsi stopped, but his eyes never left Hardin's face. They burned with a cold, contained fury. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. This was it. This was the moment where law became a weapon, where truth had no currency. Hardin had arrived with his verdict already decided. Thomas Briggs's lies had provided the excuse, and the train robbery had provided the justification. They were caught in a net that had been woven long before this day. "My people are not thieves or murderers," Delgin said, his voice ringing with a deep, unshakable authority. "If you seek justice, you will not find it by punishing the innocent." "Innocence is a luxury you can no longer afford," Hardin retorted. "My orders are clear. I am to secure the return of the stolen mail and payroll, and I am to take custody of the men responsible for the attack." He paused, letting the weight of his next words fall upon them. "I will give you until sunrise. You will turn over the men who attacked that train, and you will return every last dollar of what was stolen. If you do not, I will consider this entire band hostile, and I will take the justice that is owed." A collective gasp went through the people of the camp. The ultimatum was a death sentence. It was an impossible demand. They could not turn over men they did not have. They could not return money they had never stolen. Hardin was not offering them a choice. He was giving them the terms of their own destruction. He was manufacturing a war. Delgin stared at the captain for a long, silent moment. The old man's face was a mask of sorrow and weary resignation. He had seen this moment coming his entire life. He had spent years trying to lead his people down the narrow, treacherous path of peace. And now the path had ended at the edge of a cliff. "You ask for ghosts," the old man said softly. "We cannot give you what we do not possess." "Then you will give me a fight," Hardin said, a grim finality in his tone. He turned on his heel without another word, strode back to his horse, and swung himself into the saddle. He raised his hand, and the line of blue-coated soldiers turned as one, their movements precise and mechanical. They trotted away, their progress stirring a rising cloud of dust that hung in the air like a shroud. They were gone, but their ultimatum remained, a poison seeping into the heart of the camp. Sunrise. The word echoed in the sudden, terrible silence. The smoke that had been a distant rumor on the horizon had now arrived, and it was the smoke of a coming battle. When law and justice were bent to the will of men like Hardin, there was no choice left but the one made with conscience, and Evelyn knew, as she looked at Tatsi's dark, resolute face, that their consciences would not allow them to surrender to a lie. The last hours of darkness were not filled with chaos, but with a quiet, heartbreaking order. There was no wailing, no panic. This was a sorrow too old and too deep for hysterics. It was a ritual the Apache knew by heart. The women moved like ghosts in the firelight, packing what little they could carry into leather bundles, dried meat, water skins, precious medicinal herbs. Children, their eyes wide and solemn, were hushed and kept close, their small hands clutching their mother's dresses. The warriors moved apart from the others, their faces grim and resolved. They checked their bowstrings, sharpened the points of their arrows, and spoke in low, guttural tones. They were not preparing for a battle they expected to win. They were preparing to sell their lives dearly for the time their families needed to escape. Evelyn worked alongside Neski and Shimalis, her hands moving automatically, her mind a numb void. She packed food, her fingers fumbling with the rawhide ties. She tried to offer a comforting smile to a small child, but her facial muscles felt frozen. She belonged here now. Her place was here, with these people who had shown her nothing but a quiet, steady acceptance. To leave them now felt like tearing her own heart from her chest. Tatsi found her by the creek, where she had gone to fill the last of the water skins. He came up behind her so silently that she only knew he was there when his shadow fell over the water. She turned, and the sight of his face in the pale moonlight stole the air from her lungs. The stoic mask was gone. In its place was a raw, aching tenderness, and a resolve that was as hard as granite. In his hands, he held the reins of her mare, already saddled. "No," she whispered, the word a plea. "I am staying. I can help. I can tend to the wounded. I can—" "No," he cut her off, his voice low but absolute. "Your face is their excuse. If you are here, they will call it a rescue. They will show no mercy. If you are gone, it does not save us, but it takes away their lie." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers, willing her to understand the terrible logic of it. "I cannot fight them and protect you. My body can only be in one place. My heart will be in two." Tears she did not know she had left to cry welled in her eyes. "This is my home now. You are my family. To run is to be a coward. It is to betray you." He stepped closer, closing the small space between them. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the water skin from her hands, setting it on the ground. Then he raised his hands and cupped her face, his palms rough with calluses, but his touch infinitely gentle. "To live is not betrayal," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "To live is to keep a promise. It is the bravest thing you can do now." He lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, their worlds reduced to this single point of contact. She closed her eyes, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers, the scent of wood smoke and desert sage that was uniquely him. She could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his heart through the ground, or perhaps it was her own. "There is a mission," he murmured against her skin, his breath warm. "The old adobe walls, 2 days' ride to the west, follow the sun. The sisters there are good women. They will give you shelter." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "You will ride. You will not look back. You will live. Evelyn." He took one of his hands from her face and pressed it flat against her chest, directly over her heart. The hawk pendant was a hard knot beneath his palm. "If you live," he said, and his voice was a raw, ragged vow, "I will find you here. I will always find you." Her control shattered. A single, wrenching sob escaped her lips. She did not cry for herself, but for him, for the impossible choice he was making, for the profound and terrible love that demanded this sacrifice. He did not pull away. He simply held her gaze, his own eyes glistening with an unshed moisture in the moonlight. He led her to the mare and lifted her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing. He handed her the reins and the lead rope for a small pack mule carrying the water and food she had just prepared. For a final second, his hand rested on hers on the saddle horn. He squeezed her fingers once, a final, silent message of everything he could not say. Then he stepped back. Go now, before the sky lightens. She turned the mare's head, her movements stiff and jerky, like a broken puppet. She did not dare look back at his face. She nudged the horse into a walk, leading the mule out of the camp through a narrow, hidden trail that wound up the side of the canyon. The path was steep and treacherous in the dark, but the mare was sure-footed. The ride was a blur of grief. The wind began to pick up, a low moan through the rocks that sounded like the weeping of ghosts. It tugged at her hair and chilled her to the bone. Her mind was a maelstrom of conflict. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to stand with her husband, to share his fate. But the feel of his forehead against hers, the solemn weight of his promise, was a stronger command. To honor him, she had to obey. To love him, she had to leave him. By the time the first pale, gray light of dawn began to silhouette the eastern mountains, she was miles away, on the vast, open plain. The wind was a living thing now, a relentless, scouring force that picked up sand and grit, flinging it against her with 1,000 tiny, stinging needles. The sky was a strange, sickly yellow. A dust storm was coming. She leaned low over the horse's neck, shielding her face as best she could. The world dissolved into a howling, swirling vortex of sand. She could not see more than a few feet in any direction. The sun, when it rose, was a weak, diffuse glow behind the suffocating curtain of dust. She had only her instinct and the horse's will to guide her west. The hours bled into one another. The wind was a physical assault, trying to rip her from the saddle. The sand worked its way into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked and bleeding. The mule, patient and stoic, plodded along behind her. The mare's breathing became labored, each gasp a painful rasp. Evelyn spoke to the horse, her words snatched away by the gale, offering encouragement she did not feel. The hawk pendant, tucked inside her dress, swung back and forth, a cold, rhythmic weight against her chest, a constant reminder of her purpose, pressing her hand against it. She could almost feel the phantom pressure of his palm over hers. I will find you here. The words became a prayer, a mantra against the howling of the wind and the screaming of her own despair. Late in the afternoon, the storm began to abate. The wind lessened, and the thickest of the dust settled, leaving the air thick with a hazy, yellow light. She found herself on a high, rocky mesa. Her body was one deep, throbbing ache. She was caked in a layer of grime, her skin raw and chapped. She slid from the saddle, her legs barely able to hold her, and gave the mare a precious few swallows of water before drinking sparingly herself. She turned and looked back the way she had come. The storm had passed there as well. The air was unnaturally clear. Far in the distance, a dark smudge against the horizon. She could just make out the shape of the canyon that had been her home. And then she heard it. It was a faint, far-away sound, carried on the lingering wind, a series of rapid pops, thin and sharp, like a child's firecrackers. But it was not firecrackers. It was the sound of rifle fire. A volley, then another, the distinct, scattered retort of carbines and rifles, echoing across the vast, empty landscape. The attack had begun. The sound pierced through her exhaustion, a blade of ice in her heart. The camp was fighting. The men she knew, the women, Delgin, Neske, Chimales, Tatsi. A wave of blackness threatened to overwhelm her. She staggered, catching herself on the saddle. She could see it in her mind, the chaos, the smoke, the blue-coated soldiers advancing. She could see Tatsi standing his ground, a warrior defending his people to the last. The gunfire continued, a distant, deadly pulse. The life of the camp, the world that had saved her, was being extinguished, and he had sent her away so that she would not be extinguished with it. Her grief was a raw, physical agony, but something else rose with it, a fierce, desperate resolve. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She would not let his last act of love die with her in this desert. She would live. She would get to the mission. She would honor the promise that was now the only thing she had left of him. With a cry that was torn from the deepest part of her soul, a sound of both anguish and defiance, she pulled herself back into the saddle. She did not look back again. She fixed her eyes on the western horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, and spurred the exhausted mare into a painful, stumbling trot. She had to live, because he had told her to, because he had promised he would find her. The world beyond the howling sand was a landscape of raw survival. For 2 days, Evelyn rode west. Her entire existence narrowed to a single, burning purpose: live. The sun was a merciless hammer, the wind a constant thief of moisture and resolve. The sounds of the distant battle echoed in her memory, a ghostly counterpoint to the plodding rhythm of the horse's hooves. She measured her life in swallows of water and the slow, westward crawl of her shadow. She found the mission at dusk on the 2nd day. It was not a grand cathedral, but a humble, sprawling structure of thick adobe walls, weathered to the color of the earth itself. A simple wooden cross stood silhouetted against the bruised purple sky. It looked less like a fortress of God and more like a shelter that had surrendered to the landscape, a place of quiet endurance. A small bell hung in an arched opening, silent. An old man with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple opened the heavy wooden gate, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her. He led her into a courtyard where a single, ancient fig tree provided a canopy of deep green shade. A woman in the simple brown habit of a nun emerged from a doorway. She was middle-aged, with a round, kind face and eyes that held a deep, compassionate intelligence. "My child," the sister said, her voice calm and gentle as she took in Evelyn's filthy, ragged appearance. "You are in need of rest." There were no questions, no demands for explanation. There was only a quiet, immediate acceptance. This was Sister Maria, and in her presence, the frantic, desperate energy that had propelled Evelyn across the desert finally gave out. She allowed herself to be led to a small, whitewashed cell containing a simple cot and a wooden crucifix on the wall. Another sister brought a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. As Evelyn washed the layers of dust and grief from her face and hands, she felt as if she were shedding a skin, leaving the grime of her terrible journey behind. But the hollowness inside remained. The days at the mission settled into a muted, colorless routine. Life was governed by the ringing of the small bell for morning prayers, for meals, for work, for evening vespers. Evelyn was given simple tasks. She stirred vast pots of thin corn gruel in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and lime. She washed endless piles of linen, her hands growing raw in the lye soap, finding a strange, punishing comfort in the repetitive motion of scrubbing the cloth against a wooden board. She swept the dust from the stone floors of the chapel, the rhythmic whisk of her broom the only sound in the cool, silent space. She moved through these tasks like a phantom, her body present but her soul absent. Her spirit was still miles away, in a hidden canyon, listening for the echo of gunfire. The sisters were kind. They spoke to her in soft tones, never prying, never judging. Sister Maria would often sit with her in the evenings, in the quiet of the courtyard under the fig tree, speaking of her garden, of the challenges of mending the leaky roof, of the simple, tangible realities of their life. It was an offering of peace, an attempt to ground Evelyn in the present. But Evelyn's mind refused to be anchored. She would read from the Bible her mother had given her, the familiar words of the Psalms, a strange and alien language now. They spoke of a God of mercy and justice, but she could find no evidence of either in the world she now inhabited. The only prayer that felt real was the one she whispered into her pillow each night, a single, desperate word. Tatsi. It was an incantation, A plea, a tether to the hope she was terrified of losing. Weeks crawled by. The fierce heat of summer settled over the land, baking the adobe walls and making the air shimmer. Rumors, like dust devils, would occasionally swirl in from the outside world. A traveling peddler, a group of prospectors, and sometimes a patrol of soldiers stopping for the mission's cool well water. One blistering afternoon, a small cavalry detachment arrived, led by a young, boastful lieutenant. They watered their horses and filled their canteens, their loud voices and the jingle of their spurs a jarring intrusion into the mission's quiet sanctuary. Evelyn was in the kitchen, grinding corn, but she could hear them through the open doorway as they spoke to Sister Maria. "Things are quietening down now, sister," the lieutenant said, his voice full of the easy confidence of a man who believes he is on the victorious side. "We taught those hostiles a lesson they will not soon forget. Captain Hardin ran a clean campaign, broke their back for good." Another soldier laughed. "Clean is one word for it. There is not much left of that camp but ashes. We recovered some of the mail, too. Proves they were the ones who hit the train." Evelyn's hands stopped moving. The stone mano felt impossibly heavy in her grip. Ashes. The word was a hammer blow to her heart. "Were there many casualties?" Sister Maria asked, her voice carefully neutral. "They fought like cornered devils," the lieutenant boasted, "but they were no match for army rifles. We took no prisoners. It is the only way to deal with their kind. Make an example of them." No prisoners. The words were a death sentence, delivered with a casual, chilling indifference. Evelyn felt the room begin to spin. The air grew thin. She pushed herself to her feet, needing to escape, to breathe. She grabbed a heavy clay water jug, an olla, needing a reason to be outside, away from the poison of their words. She stumbled into the courtyard, her eyes unseeing. The soldiers were mounting their horses, still laughing and talking. Ashes, no prisoners. The phrases echoed in her head, a brutal, relentless drumbeat. Her world, which had been held together by the single, fragile thread of hope, was unraveling. The future he had promised her, the life he had sent her to preserve, was a lie. He was gone. They were all gone. Her grip on the heavy jug slackened. It slipped from her numb fingers. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, and then it fell, crashing onto the stone flags of the courtyard with a sound that was shockingly loud and final. It shattered into a dozen large pieces, the water spreading out in a dark, spreading stain. She looked down at the wreckage. It was her life, her world, broken and spilled upon the ground. As she knelt to pick up the pieces, her hand closed around a large, sharp shard of clay. The edge bit deep into the soft flesh of her palm. A bright, startling line of red welled up. She stared at it, transfixed. The physical pain was a distant thing, a small, sharp counterpoint to the vast, crushing agony in her soul. The sight of her own blood was a strange comfort. It was real. It was proof that she was still alive, even if everything she had lived for was dead. This cut, this scar she would carry, was the final, bloody seal on the promise he had made her. It was a vow etched into her own skin. Evelyn, Sister Maria, was at her side, her face a mask of concern. She gently took Evelyn's hand, clucking her tongue at the sight of the deep cut. "Come, my child, we must clean this." She led Evelyn to the infirmary and carefully washed and bandaged the wound. The sister's touch was gentle, her silence a profound act of empathy. She knew. She did not need to be told that the broken jug was more than a simple accident. That night, the summer heat finally broke. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue for weeks, turned a bruised and angry gray. Clouds boiled up over the mountains, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves of the fig tree. Evelyn lay on her cot, her bandaged hand throbbing in time with her broken heart. She did not whisper his name tonight. Hope was a cruelty she could no longer afford. The storm outside grew in fury, the thunder cracking directly overhead, the wind howling around the thick adobe walls. Then the rain came, not in drops, but in a solid, driving sheet, a deluge that sounded as if it meant to wash the world away. A frantic pounding on the main gate cut through the roar of the storm. Evelyn sat up, her heart lurching. No one traveled in a storm like this. She heard the old gatekeeper shouting, and then the groaning creak of the heavy gate being opened. She was drawn by a force she did not understand, pulling on her shawl and stepping out into the covered walkway that circled the courtyard. The rain was a solid wall of water, turned into a silver, shifting curtain by the flashes of lightning. In the center of the courtyard, illuminated for a brief, stark moment, stood a figure. It was a man, swaying on his feet, his clothes torn and plastered to his body by the rain. He was leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. Another flash of lightning lit the scene, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The man was Apache. He took a staggering step forward, into the faint, flickering light of a lantern by the chapel door. And then another. He was gaunt, his face a hollowed-out mask of pain and exhaustion. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest with a blood-soaked strip of cloth, and his leg was dragging, clearly injured. He looked up, his eyes searching the shadows of the walkway. For a heart-stopping second, his gaze met hers. Even through the rain and the pain, she knew those eyes. The world stopped, the thunder, the rain, the howling wind. All of it faded into a roaring silence in her ears. Hope, which she had buried and mourned, erupted in her chest with a force that was almost painful. It was impossible. It was a miracle. It was him. "Tatsi," she breathed. The name a prayer, a sob, a shout. He seemed to gather the last of his strength at the sound of her voice. He took one more lurching step toward her, and then his legs gave out. He crumpled to the ground, a puppet with its strings cut, and lay still in the deepening puddles. She did not remember running. She was simply there, kneeling in the mud and the rain beside him, her hands hovering over his still form, afraid to touch him, afraid this was a ghost her grief had conjured. But the rain plastering his black hair to his forehead was real. The gash on his temple was real. She reached out with her uninjured hand and touched his cheek. His skin was cold, but it was the skin of a living man. He stirred at her touch, his eyelids fluttering. His lips moved, forming her name, a sound that was barely a whisper. Lost in the roar of the storm, he had kept his promise. Through the fire of battle and the blood of his people, through injury and a desperate journey across the desert, he had come for her. He had found her. The world snapped back into focus with the force of a physical blow. In an instant, Evelyn was no longer a victim of her grief, but a commander in a desperate battle for a single life. She scrambled to her feet, the rain and mud forgotten. "Help me!" she cried, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. The old gatekeeper, Mateo, and Sister Maria were already moving, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and grim purpose. The storm raged around them, a chaotic symphony of wind and water, but within their small circle of lantern light, there was only a sharp, silent focus. Together, the three of them managed to lift Tatsi's dead weight. He was lighter than he should have been, a man whittled down by starvation and hardship. They half carried, half dragged him out of the deluge and into a small, dry storage room at the back of the infirmary. It was a hidden, windowless space, smelling of dried herbs and dust, a place easily overlooked. It was the safest room in the mission. They laid him on a cot, and his brokenness became starkly apparent in the steady candlelight. His face was pale and gaunt beneath his tan, his lips blue with cold. His clothes were a collection of rags, and the crude bandage on his arm was soaked through with a mixture of blood and rain. Sister Maria moved with the calm efficiency of a seasoned healer. "Mateo, bring hot water and all the clean linen you can find," she commanded softly. To Evelyn, she said, "Child, we must get these wet clothes off him before the chill takes him completely." A profound shift occurred within Evelyn. The girl who had been protected, who had been sent away for her own safety, was gone. In her place was a woman with a single, unyielding purpose to protect him. All the fear, the grief, the helpless waiting of the past weeks coalesced into a fierce, protective energy. Her hands, which had trembled with sorrow just hours before, were now steady as she worked with Sister Maria to cut away the sodden fabric of his shirt. The wounds were terrifying. A ragged tear in the flesh of his upper arm looked to be from a bullet, the skin around it inflamed and angry. His leg was badly swollen, a deep, infected gash visible on his calf. He was covered in a web of smaller cuts and bruises, a testament to a brutal, desperate journey. For a moment, the sheer scale of his suffering threatened to overwhelm her. But then she met Sister Maria's calm, steady gaze, and her resolve hardened. For the next 2 days, the small, candle-lit room became her entire world. She and the sister worked in shifts, though Evelyn rarely slept. They cleaned his wounds with boiled water and pungent herbal poultices. They forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips to fight the fever that began to rage through his body. The fever was a relentless tide, pulling him under into a dark, churning delirium, then receding just enough to give them a flicker of hope before dragging him back down again. The single candle on the small table beside his cot became a symbol of his life, guttering and flaring, threatening at any moment to be extinguished. In the depths of his fever, he would murmur in his own language, the words a torrent of memories and pain she could not understand. But sometimes, one word would surface from the wreckage, a name spoken with a desperate, heartbreaking clarity. "Evelyn," he would call for her, his voice a raw whisper, his hand twitching on the rough blanket as if searching for her. In those moments, she would take his hand, her touch gentle, and speak to him in a low, soothing voice. "I am here, Tatsi, I am here. You are safe." She did not know if he could hear her, but she had to believe that her presence was a small anchor in the storm of his fevered mind. The mission existed in a state of quiet, nervous conspiracy. Sister Maria told the other sisters only that a sick traveler had taken refuge from the storm. Food was brought to the room in secret. Mateo stood a silent, watchful guard. The risk they were taking was enormous. Harboring a fugitive Apache, a survivor of a battle the army considered a righteous victory, was an act of treason. If they were discovered, the mission's gentle charity would be seen as sedition. The weight of this choice settled heavily on Evelyn's shoulders. To save him, she was endangering the very people who had saved her. Yet, there was no choice. Her decision had been made the moment she saw him fall. On the third night, the fever reached its terrifying peak. His body was rigid, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sister Maria worked tirelessly, bathing his face with cool cloths, but the heat radiating from his skin was relentless. Evelyn knelt by his cot, her hands clasped in a prayer that was more fierce than pious. She was not asking for a miracle. She was demanding it. She had not survived the desert only to lose him to a fever in this quiet room. Sometime in the dark, desperate hours before dawn, the crisis passed. The tension in his body eased. His breathing deepened, becoming slow and regular. A sheen of sweat broke on his forehead, and Evelyn knew, with a surge of overwhelming relief, that the fever had broken. The battle was not over, but the tide had turned. The flame of the candle, which had sputtered and danced all night, now burned with a small, steady light, exhausted. Evelyn laid her head on the edge of his cot and finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke to a gentle touch on her hair. She lifted her head, her neck stiff and found Tatsi watching her. He was awake, truly awake. The delirium was gone from his eyes. They were clear and lucid, though shadowed with pain and exhaustion. He was terribly weak, but he was himself. Words failed her. She could only look at him, her heart a painful, joyous knot in her chest. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. She quickly brought a cup of water to his lips. Supporting his head with her hand, he drank deeply. "Evelyn," he finally whispered, his voice still rough.
"I am here,"
she answered, her own voice trembling. His gaze was intense, full of 1,000 questions. His good hand, the one not bound to his chest, moved weakly, shakily, across the blanket. It was a journey of inches, but it seemed to take all the strength he had. His fingers brushed against her throat, finding the leather cord of the hawk pendant. He closed his fingers around the smooth, cool bone, his touch a confirmation, a question. "You kept it," he whispered. The words were not an accusation, but a statement of awe. She covered his hand with her own, pressing it and the pendant to her heart. She met his gaze, her eyes clear and certain, and gave him the truth that had sustained her through the desert and the despair. "I kept everything." A profound peace settled in his eyes. It was an answer to every question, a balm on every wound. He did not need to ask if she still believed in him, if she still held to the promise they had made. Her words, her presence, said it all. His eyes drifted closed, and he fell into a true, healing sleep. The quiet, hopeful peace of that moment was shattered an hour later by the sound of shod horses in the courtyard, and a loud, authoritative knock on the main gate. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She flew to the small crack in the storage room door. It was a cavalry patrol, their blue uniforms a stark and terrifying sight. "Stay here," Sister Maria whispered, her face pale but composed. "Do not make a sound." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear the lieutenant's voice, the same one who had boasted of the camp's destruction. They were checking the outlying missions. He was explaining, looking for any stragglers, any wounded hostiles who might have escaped the battle. Evelyn backed away from the door, her eyes wide with terror, and bumped into the small table, rattling the tin cup. Tatsi's eyes flew open, instantly alert, the warrior within him responding to the nearby threat. She put a finger to her lips, her eyes begging him to be silent. The footsteps stopped outside their door. "What is in this room, Sister?" the lieutenant asked. His voice was casual, but it held a sharp edge of suspicion. "Merely our winter medical supplies. Lieutenant," Sister Maria's voice was as calm as a summer morning, "and a few things in need of repair." "I see," the soldier said. There was a long, terrible pause. "You seem to be cooking more food than usual. Your charity is well known, but I trust it does not extend to enemies of the United States government." This was it, the moment of discovery. But Evelyn's fear was suddenly consumed by a surge of pure, defiant anger. She would not let them take him. Before Sister Maria could answer, Evelyn strode to the door and pushed it open a few inches, blocking the view of the room with her own body. She looked the young lieutenant directly in the eye, a weary, exasperated expression on her face. "If you must know, Lieutenant," she said, her voice dripping with a convincing irritation, "we have been up all night with a sick and stubborn old goat." The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. "Mateo," she continued, improvising wildly. "Our gatekeeper. He was kicked by a mule yesterday. He has a head as thick as a stone, and he is convinced he is dying. The sister has been brewing every remedy she knows, and I have been making him broth. Honestly, the mule showed remarkable judgment." A flicker of amusement crossed the lieutenant's face. The image of the grumpy old gatekeeper laid low by a mule was a believable and satisfyingly mundane explanation. The drama he was looking for was not here. He glanced from Evelyn's tired face to Sister Maria's serenely pious one. and was convinced. "I see," he said, his tone losing its edge. "Well, see that you inform the post if any other travelers seek your charity." "Of course, Lieutenant," Sister Maria said smoothly. They listened as the soldiers' footsteps receded, as they mounted their horses and rode out of the gate. The danger, for now, had passed. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her legs suddenly weak with relief. She had done it. She had stood between Tatsi and the world, a shield made of a quick wit and a desperate love. She turned back into the room. Tatsi was watching her, a look of profound, unreadable emotion in his dark eyes. He had seen what she had done. He had seen her protect him. The storm had passed, both outside and in. As the first light of a clean-washed dawn began to filter through the cracks in the mission walls, she knew that their reunion was more than just a promise kept. It was a new promise made they would face the coming day, and whatever it brought, together. His strength returned slowly, a trickle of water seeping back into a dry riverbed. For a full week after the soldiers' visit, Tatsi remained hidden in the small storeroom, his world a landscape of shadows and whispered conversations. Evelyn became his guardian, his nurse, and his anchor to the living world. She brought him food, changed his bandages, and sat with him for hours, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, a sight that was still a breathtaking miracle. The bond between them, forged in fear and tempered by sacrifice, deepened into a quiet, unshakable intimacy in the confines of that small, dark room. But the mission, for all its kindness, was a cage. The fear of discovery was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their days. Every distant shout, every hoofbeat on the trail, sent a jolt of anxiety through Evelyn. They could not stay. One night, when the moon was a sliver of silver in a star-dusted sky, he was strong enough. "We leave before the sun," he said, his voice quiet but firm. His arm was still bound to his chest, and he leaned heavily on a sturdy staff Mateo had carved for him. But the light of purpose had returned to his eyes. Sister Maria met them in the courtyard. She did not try to dissuade them. She understood that a life lived in hiding was no life at all. She pressed a bundle into Evelyn's hands, a small sack of dried corn, a loaf of dense bread, and a skin of fresh water.
"Vaya con Dios,"
she whispered, making the sign of the cross on both their foreheads. Go with God. It was a blessing that transcended the boundaries of their different faiths, a simple prayer for safety from a good woman's heart. They had only one horse between them, Evelyn's weary mare. Tatsi, with his injured leg, rode. Evelyn walked beside him, her hand resting on his good knee, a steadying presence. They slipped out of the mission's gate like shadows, leaving the sanctuary behind them and turning their faces south, toward the rugged, unknown mountains. Their journey was a pilgrimage. They followed the winding, life-giving artery of the Salt River, its water a cool blessing in the heat of the day. The world was vast and empty, a beautiful, lonely wilderness of red rock and pale green sage. The ghosts of what they had lost walked with them. In the quiet of the afternoons, a profound sadness would sometimes wash over Evelyn, a grief for Neske's quiet wisdom, for Kumalis's gentle friendship, for the laughter of children and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the camp. She would weep silently as she walked, the tears leaving clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Tatsi would say nothing, but his hand would come to rest on her head, a silent acknowledgement of their shared sorrow. But there were moments of grace, too. As his strength grew, a lightness returned to him. One evening, as they made camp under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, he pointed out the constellations, telling her their Apache names and the stories that went with them. She, in turn, hummed a soft, simple hymn her mother had taught her, the melody a fragile thread connecting her to a past that felt a lifetime away. They learned the landscape of each other's memories in the quiet of the desert nights. One day, he was strong enough to walk for a short time, giving the mare a rest. He took his bow, which he had managed to save, and disappeared into a thicket of mesquite. He returned half an hour later with a plump rabbit, as Evelyn skillfully prepared and cooked the meat over their small fire. A feeling of simple, profound rightness settled over her. This was life, stripped down to its barest essentials: a fire, food, and the presence of the one person who was her true north. In the midst of their hardship, they found a strange and resilient joy. They were alive, and they were together. After nearly a week of travel, the terrain began to change. The flat river plains gave way to steep, rocky slopes covered in the dark, twisted shapes of juniper and pinyon pine. They were climbing into the high country, a hidden, secret world of deep canyons and soaring peaks. Tatsi knew the way, guiding them through narrow passes and along trails that were little more than goat paths. They found the village in a high mountain valley, a place of breathtaking beauty and isolation. It was not their old camp. The wickiups were new, the ground not yet packed hard by generations of life. This was a place of refuge, a place where the survivors had gathered to begin again. As they approached, a silence fell over the small settlement. Figures emerged from the dwellings, their faces etched with a sorrow so deep it was a permanent part of their features. These were the remnants of his people, the ones who had escaped the canyon. They watched their approach with a guarded, weary stillness. Their eyes, when they fell on Evelyn, were not hostile, but they were full of a deep, painful questioning. She was a ghost from the world that had brought them this grief. Her white skin was a symbol of the soldiers, the rifles, the fire that had consumed their homes and their families. She clutched the hawk pendant at her throat, her knuckles white. She had never felt more like an outsider, more like an intruder. A terrible question echoed in her own heart. Am I worthy of being here? Am I just a painful reminder of all they have lost? An old man, his hair as white as the winter snow, stepped forward. His authority was a quiet, powerful thing, a mantle of leadership born of tragedy. He was the new chieftain, the one who had gathered the scattered survivors. He looked at Tatsi, a profound sadness and a deep affection in his eyes. Then his gaze moved to Evelyn, and his expression became an unreadable mask of stone. He spoke to Tatsi in their own tongue, his voice a low rumble. Evelyn did not need to understand the words to know the question. It was the same question she saw in every face, the same question that was screaming in her own soul. Why is she here? Tatsi stood straight, his hand still resting on her shoulder. He looked not at the chieftain, but at the faces of the people gathered around them, the women whose eyes were haunted by loss, the men whose bodies were scarred with the memory of battle. He answered in English, his voice clear and steady, so that she and all of them would understand. The chieftain asks why I have brought the white woman back to us after the white man's war. A tense, heavy silence followed his words. The air was thick with unspoken pain. Evelyn's heart felt as if it would stop beating. Her entire future, their entire future, rested on his next words. Tatsi's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, a small, reassuring pressure. He looked at the chieftain, his gaze direct and unwavering. I brought her back, he said, and his voice rang with a quiet, unshakable conviction, because she is my courage. The words fell into the silence. Simple, profound, and utterly unexpected. Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes locking with his. My courage. He was not talking about her physical strength or any great deed she had performed. He was talking about the will to live he had found in her, the reason he had fought his way back from the brink of death, the promise of a future that had pulled him across the desert. He was telling his people that she was not a symbol of their destruction, but the reason for his survival. A murmur went through the small crowd. The chieftain's stony expression softened, a flicker of understanding in his weary eyes. He looked at Evelyn, truly looked at her this time. not as a white woman, but as the woman his warrior had named as his strength. He saw the hawk pendant at her throat, a small, pale bird against her tanned skin, and he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He saw the strength she had, the endurance in her eyes, the fierce, protective love that bound her to the man at her side. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice no longer a challenge, but a proclamation. "Then she is one of us," he said. "She has a place by our fire." The tension in the air did not break so much as dissolve, like mist burning off in the morning sun. A woman with kind, sad eyes stepped forward and offered Evelyn a small bowl of water. It was a simple gesture, but it was an act of profound acceptance, a welcoming. Evelyn took it, her hands trembling, and drank. The water was cool and sweet, and it tasted like coming home. She looked at Tatsi, her heart overflowing with a love and a gratitude so immense it left no room for words. He had not just brought her to his people, he had brought her into his heart, and in front of them all, he had declared that she belonged there. The high mountain valley became their world, a sanctuary carved out of the sky and stone. Life began again, not as it had been, but as it could be, pieced together from the fragments of memory and the resilient sinews of hope. The process of building a home was a slow, deliberate healing. Tatsi, his body still mending, showed Evelyn how to choose the right willow and cottonwood branches for the frame of their wickiup. She, in turn, used her skill with a needle to stitch the cattail mats and animal hides together, her fingers moving with a new, practiced confidence. Their hands worked in concert, weaving together not just a shelter, but a shared life. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. He taught her the ways of the high country, the tracks of the deer, the calls of the eagles that soared above the peaks. She learned which roots to dig for medicine, which berries were sweet, and which would bring a fever. Her knowledge of the written word, once a relic of a useless past, found a new purpose. She would draw pictures in the dirt to teach Tatsi English words, and he would correct her Apache pronunciation with a patience that was a form of love in itself. Their separate pasts began to merge into a single, shared present. The ghosts were still there. In the evenings, when the fires burned low, the people would gather and speak in quiet tones of the ones they had lost. The sorrow was a communal blanket, a shared weight that made the burden of survival possible. Evelyn, the white woman among them, did not try to offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she offered her hands. She helped the women grind corn. She cared for the children whose mothers had been lost. She sat with the widows and listened, her quiet presence a testament to a grief that transcended blood or race. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of the tapestry of their survival. Her own growth was a quiet, internal blossoming. The timid girl who had wept on her wedding night, who had seen herself as a victim of circumstance, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, a strength forged in the desert and tested by fire. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of choosing to live and to love, in spite of it. Her marriage, once a debt of honor, had become a partnership of the soul, a quiet and profound union that was the bedrock of her new life. One night, they walked away from the village, following a narrow path to a place where the Salt River began its long journey down from the high peaks. The water was a ribbon of liquid silver under a canopy of stars so vast and brilliant it took the breath away. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. From the distant village, they could hear the faint, rhythmic beat of a single drum, a sound not of mourning, but of endurance. It was the heartbeat of a people who had refused to be erased. They sat on a large, flat rock overlooking the water, their shoulders touching. The silence between them was full and comfortable, a language all its own. "When I was a girl," Evelyn said softly, her voice barely disturbing the stillness, I used to look at the stars from my window and feel so terribly small and alone. Tatsi was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the star-dusted sky. They are the campfires of our ancestors, he said, his voice a low murmur. You are never alone. They are watching. They see our hearts. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft starlight. The lines of pain and hardship were still there, but they were softened by a deep and abiding peace. When two souls are true, he said, his voice full of a quiet certainty, no storm can hide their light. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. The words were a perfect expression of their journey, of the small, defiant flame of their love that had refused to be extinguished by the winds of hatred and violence. In this place, under the watchful eyes of his ancestors, she felt a sense of peace she had never known, a feeling of finally, truly being home. Their quiet life was not one of escape, but of healing. They both knew that the world beyond their mountain sanctuary still existed, a world of laws that had been twisted into weapons, of men like Captain Hardin who saw justice as a thing to be imposed by the barrel of a gun. The story of the battle, as told by the army, would be one of righteous victory over savage hostiles. The lie would be carved into the official records, a permanent stain on the honor of his people. This knowledge was a quiet, shared sorrow, a wound that had not yet scarred over. A few days later, the old chieftain sent for them. They met him outside his wickiup as the sun was setting, bathing the valley in a gentle, golden light. His face was grave, but his eyes, when they met theirs, held a deep and powerful resolve. My son, he said to Tatsi, you have rested, you have healed, but the spirit of our people is still wounded. A lie is a poison that sickens the memory of the dead and weakens the hearts of the living. From within his dwelling, he brought out a tattered, stained piece of canvas. It was a U.S. mail pouch. A dark, ugly hole was torn through the center of it, a hole made not by an arrow, but by a bullet. One of our young scouts found this, the chieftain explained, his voice low and heavy with the weight of memory. On the morning of the attack, it was half buried in a wash 2 miles from our canyon, in the direction of the railroad tracks. He brought it to me just as the soldiers were sighted. There was no time. He looked from Tatsi to Evelyn, his gaze lingering on her. This is a thing of your world. It is a piece of their truth. He held it out. Tatsi took it, his face a grim mask. He and Evelyn examined the pouch in the fading light. The bullet hole was proof. The location where it was found was proof. It was a small, tangible piece of the truth, a key that could unlock the lie that had cost them so much. It was the legacy of a fallen warrior, a final gift from the scout who had not survived the battle. The chieftain placed a hand on Tatsi's shoulder, and then on Evelyn's. Love does not erase war, the old man said, his voice full of a weary wisdom. But it teaches us how not to be like war. It teaches us to seek truth, not vengeance. He left them then, standing alone with the evidence in their hands as the first stars of evening began to appear. The weight of the decision they had to make settled over them. They could stay here, in the safety of their hidden valley, and let the lie stand. They could live out their lives in peace and let the world forget. Or they could take this piece of truth and walk back into the world that had tried to destroy them. Evelyn looked at the mail pouch, then at the man beside her. She saw not just the warrior, not just her husband, but the healer, the man who had shown her the meaning of courage, and she knew her own path was now inextricably bound to his. The journey that had begun with her as a frightened bride, a pawn in a game of honor and debt, had led her to this moment of profound and absolute choice. She placed her hand over his on the rough canvas of the pouch. We cannot let a lie be the final word, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength she had not known she possessed. Tatsi looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not the burden of another fight, but the light of a shared purpose. He saw his courage, standing beside him, ready to face the world not as a victim, but as a partner. Their love had been forged in the crucible of violence and loss, but it had emerged not as a fragile thing to be hidden away, but as a source of strength, a reason to fight not for vengeance, but for justice. Their life together would not be defined by the tragedy they had survived, but by the truth they would now choose to defend. He nodded. A slow, deliberate movement. The decision was made. Together, they would walk back down the mountain. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.